Hi, I'm Anjali Alappat, the host of Arcx, a series about literary inspiration. I have loved fantasy and science fiction for as long as I can remember. In these strange times, these stories are a wonderful form of escape, doorways to different worlds, offering glimpses into possible futures. In Season 2, I'm going to be talking to 8 South Asian fantasy, sci-fi, and speculative fiction writers to find out what really made them want to tell stories. We're going to talk about books, movies, TV shows, video games, and other media that shaped and influenced them as writers. We kickstart this season with author, editor, and lawyer Gautam Bhatia. Gautam's debut novel, The Wall, and its sequel, The Horizon, are guaranteed to keep you on the edge of your seat. Filled with complex social hierarchies, political plots, intricate world building, fascinating philosophy, and revolution. Today we discuss how all fiction is political, urban revolution, human nature, and origin myths. You can follow Gautam on Twitter, where he's at Gautam Bhatia 88. Hi Gautam, thank you so much for joining us today on Arcx.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
So to start things off, I traditionally ask, could you tell us a bit about your journey as a writer? Did you always want to be one?
I began life as a fan, I think as most writers of genre do. When I was in class 5 or 6, my parents got me copies of The Hobbit, and there was a big book of science fiction at home that I myself pulled out of the shelves. And I fell in love with the genre from a very young age. So I knew that I did want to write in it. And as a teenager, I think I must have written was 10 or 12 unfinished novels all in the trunk now, which will never see the light of day because they're terrible. But it was always a dream.
It's interesting that you mentioned The Hobbit. I feel like a lot of writers, especially Indian writers, were very influenced by The Hobbit as well. And were there any other books or series that really influenced you as a storyteller?
I think it was a function of what was available in India in the late 1990s. So The Hobbit was an obvious one. It was Asimov's Foundation, which again was formative. I think that for all of us, there's one book or one series that comes to us at the right time, and really we end up internalizing many of the dialogues, the characters, the scenes. And for me, that was Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials, which has recently been made into a pretty good show. So I read that as a 14 or 15-year-old, and that was incredibly formative in many ways.
So what aspects of His Dark Materials really struck a chord with you as a reader and as a writer?
I think there were 2 or 3. I think first, of course, the world building in His Dark Materials is fantastic. It's detailed, it's involved, it's atmospheric in the best of ways. It's really immersive, and many of those ideas, the alethiometer, just the amount of traveling between worlds, a subtle knife, all of that, I think, really fires up the imagination, specifically at that age. Teenage years are obviously when you are at your most anti-authoritarian and at your most questioning of any kind of instruction and authority. And His Dark Materials, when the premise is essentially it's a war against God, that is revealed slowly over the books. In book 1, Northern Lights, it begins with conflict against the established church, and then it expands into a full-blown conflict with God, and it's the idea of God. And that, I think, was just immensely powerful to someone looking for, let's say, an anti-authoritarian world to believe in. I think since then, everything else has sort of been read in the shadow of that series, and many of my ideas can be traced back to that series.
I think, as you mentioned, it is very anti-authoritarian. And while I was revisiting the books, it really struck me that the religious aspect of His Dark Materials, it seemed fairly commonplace to me as a child reading it. But now as an adult, I'm looking back and thinking, this is a very magical world, and yet religion plays such a huge role, and the church in particular. And that really fascinated me. Did that strike you as well when you were reading it?
Yeah, I mean, the series is essentially a fantasy rendition of Milton's Paradise Lost. His Dark Materials itself is a line from Paradise Lost. The opening epigraph is from Paradise Lost. Many of the core plot premises, Lyra being Eve, all of that, the sympathetic portrayal of Satan is all Paradise Lost. So it was inevitable once he went down that path, that religion would play this sort of fundamental antagonistic role. And I think the point of the book actually is to show that there is magic and ethics and morality without religion, right? So you don't need organized religion, established religion, religion that constructs hierarchies, inequalities of power, and so on, so as to then also be able to have an ethical or moral framework, or even to have a sense of magic. So I think that's a pretty important part of the books.
Something else that really struck me about Pullman's books and his characters in particular is that they're all pretty nuanced. They're not particularly likable. They're not all black and white. And characters who are capable of great evil also are capable of immense good. And did that leave an impact on you as a writer?
Yeah, I think Mrs. Coulter's character is amongst the sharpest drawn and most complex that you'll get in genre fiction. And not just that, the way it evolves over 3 books is just fantastic, right? So you begin with what seems to be a very classic textbook villain antagonist in book 1. And then, it becomes so much more complicated as the books go on. And Lord Asriel, who, again, in chapter 1, the opening of Northern Light, seems like your classic textbook hero protagonist, again, over time becomes much grayer and much more complicated as a character. And then he's almost impossible to like. And I think the TV series does a very good job of portraying both Lord Asriel and Mrs. Coulter in their full complexity. So I think that, yes, the characterization of his Dark Materials is quite complex, but at the same time also, I think the moral and ethical lines are pretty clearly drawn as well, which is, I think, natural for a book that is primarily meant to appeal to, I guess now the term is young adults. Back then, I don't know what the term was, but there are also, I think, clear moral and ethical lines. The church is antagonistic. Establishment religion is the antagonist. And Lyra and Will at times have to make difficult choices, like when Lyra has to leave Pantaleimon behind when she enters the realm of the dead. So that's a difficult choice. But I think that does not affect how we feel towards Lyra or Will.
Looking back at these books now, what aspects do you still like? What do you kind of think twice about these days?
I think they're aged quite well, and genre today, science fiction and fantasy, likes to style itself as radical and anti-authoritarian and anti-colonial and anti-capitalist and all kinds of antis. But actually, if you read a lot of genre fiction today, it's pretty conservative, even as it styles itself as, being anti-hierarchy, in that there'll be monarchies and whatever rebellion will happen in the context of existing power structures. And so I think that his Dark Materials holds up really well. It still feels radical, and the book still feels very fresh, despite being now 2 decades or more old.
Before we jump into discussing The Wall and the Horizon, I'd actually like to give you the floor to do a short reading from The Horizon.
The premise of The Wall and the Horizon is that there is a city that exists within a very, very high wall, circular wall that no one has ever been beyond, and no one knows what lies beyond the wall. And because there is a wall, that of course impacts life in the city in many ways. And one thing the book explores is how language and the ability to imagine are constrained by your physical space. So one recurring plot point is that the people within the wall have never seen a horizon, hence the name The Horizon. So is it possible to imagine a concept that you don't have a term for? The scene I'm going to read is a short scene that also deals with this kind of an idea. It's flashback, where the main character, Mithila, is remembering a moment she had with a friend of hers, Dhara, who then disappears a little later. And she's looking back and remembering it. There was a bamboo stick. It was pushed into the ground. Its thin shadow extended upon the furrowed field, matching its length. At one point on the shadow line, a twig marked the spot. "What are you doing?" Mithila said. Bent over, tracing a line from the twig along the shadow, Dhara did not reply. The summer sun blazed down upon them, making Mithila squint. The wall was a pen sketch in the background. Dhara dropped another twig a foot from the shadow tip. She straightened. Mithila saw her place her left foot on the first twig and her right foot on the second. Dhara turned to her, still standing like that. "North," she said. Her eyes were shining. "What?" "My body turns to the north." Yes," said Mithila. She cast a look around once to make sure this wasn't some bizarre test. The towers of rebirth were to her right. The map of Sumer was in her head. And yes, that meant Dhara had her back to the Rasa. North, Dhara repeated, looking at her intently, as if she expected a reaction. I know. So? Dhara pushed a strand of hair out of her eyes, a familiar gesture. Don't you see? I see a bamboo stick. I see you standing there. I hear you saying north, north, like you invented directions. What, Dhara? Oof, Dhara huffed. Mithila, Walrise is from the east. Or rather, east is what we call where Walrise happens. Yes? So as the sun travels from wall to wall, east to west, shadows will travel the other way. And if we want to know where north is, we follow the path of the shadow. Mithila's eyes began to glaze. Dhara, we know what north is. We do? Go on, tell me what north is. North is, she began mechanically. North is what you face when the quarries are to your right, like now. North is when you stand at right angles to the Rasa's flow, when your back is to the mandalas and the farms are before you. North is full marks, well done. Now tell me north without naming anything of Sumer. What? It was as if her mind was pushing up against something opaque. That makes no sense. We understand. Don't you see what I've done? Dhara said softly. She gestured at the stick, the shadow, and the twigs. This is north everywhere. This is north, not in terms of Sumer. You see, when there is no rasa, no forum, no wall, this will still be north, always. Mithila struggled with the concept. North everywhere, always, she said slowly, running her tongue around the unfamiliar combination of words. They made her dizzy, as if behind them there was something too large to contain. And we need this, Dhara smiled, when we go chase the sun.
Thank you both for the summary and for the reading. It was really lovely. And first off, what a great series. I was pretty much on the edge of my seat while reading it.
Thank you.
You ended the wall on such a merciless cliffhanger that I had to run out and buy the Horizon just to get some sleep that night. And for readers who haven't read the books, you have to. We'll pause so you can go and order it right now. The Wall and the Horizon are set in this walled city of Sumer. And for as long as human memory spans, the wall has always existed. No one has ever breached it. And somehow, despite these extraordinary circumstances, it's a city that works. There's enough food, there's enough water, there is work, there's art, there's music, and there's even a religion. It all works as long as the wall is never breached. Actually, I wanted to kick us off by asking about the world building, because it is extraordinary. And you created this really intricate world, which is filled with its own myths, religion, customs, culture, and then you literally confined it behind walls. So why?
It's a couple of things. One is that I think that one of the great things about genre and why I love it so much is that it lets you change that one thing about the world that you take for granted, and then you can ask what if, right? So the example I always give as a story that does this very well is a story called Nightfall by Asimov, where the premise is that you have a planet surrounded by 6 suns. And so at any given time, there is at least one sun in the sky. And so the inhabitants do not know what night is. And except once in 2,000 years when the stars align in a way that then nightfall. And so they don't know what stars are. Nothing in their language prepares them for night or stars. And then they see the stars. And then, I won't spoil it, but then things happen. So that the premise is that something as basic as the night, you can't imagine a world without night. And if it's not there, then how would society respond? What would society look like? What would be different? What would be the same? And that then tells you something about human beings. And so that was the idea, is to have something similar in that you don't know what a horizon is. You've never seen a horizon. Your life is bound by a physical barrier. And then what would society look like? How would it evolve? And not in a dystopic sense, but, as you said, a society that works. How would a working society look like that had this constraint, something we take for granted, that if we just walk long enough, we'll keep walking, right? What if you couldn't do that? So that was the first answer to why. And of course, influences on language and so on. The second, there was a more perhaps technical answer, which is that one thing I wanted to explore in this series was scarcity as a concept, right? In our world, economics teaches us that scarcity is a natural bound on what we can do. And there is a critique that scarcity actually is a political choice. It is a distributional choice, and scarcity need not be the kind of constraint that it is in our world if we just had a different political economy, different economic system. So I wanted to take that rhetoric of scarcity and actually give it physical form. Right? So in this world, scarcity is not debatable issue. There is scarcity, and you have to develop your world under physical constraints. And so there is a line actually at one point in the book where they say you can't vote against the wall, right? So you can vote to change your laws and so on. You have a referendum on all laws. That's part of the governance system, but you can't vote against the wall. And that actually is a riff of a line by an EU official a few years ago when Italy actually wanted to, that would have gone against neoliberal consensus. And he basically said you can't vote against neoliberalism. Like, I'm misquoting, but that's effectively what it was. So I wanted to take that ideology and then say, okay, what if the ideology had a physical form? How would society evolve and adapt? And ultimately also it's very clear that in this case, the scarcity is physical, but it is the result of human choices, in this case being the choice to build the wall, because no one knows who's built the wall and why, but obviously it is the work of human beings. And so it is physical scarcity, but the result of human choice. And then how do you respond to that? So that's sort of maybe the more technical answer of why.
And your protagonist, who you mentioned before, Mithila, she's a young woman who's very desperate to breach the wall. And the focus and determination that she puts towards this is kind of the driving factor of the books.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's so much going on that she's not actually aware of.
Yeah.
This is a single person's desire, which kind of colors the story. Why did you choose her to be the protagonist of the book?
I think the protagonist for me was someone who obviously wanted to go beyond the wall, because that's what drives the story. And I think the key thing here is that, as I said before, this is not a dystopia. The society works. It's not the kind of oppressive regime that then triggers revolution or triggers further oppression and a failed revolution. That's, to me, sort of boring, right? What I wanted to do was that, okay, here's a world where you actually do have the foundations for a stable life already there. And then what motivates you to find something else, and to trace how that motivation becomes clear to you as a person as the story goes. So that is why the protagonist is who she is. It's someone who you begin the story with as someone who has this inchoate desire to go beyond the wall. In fact, part of it is to do with the fact that her elder brother, who was the leader of their group, he perishes in, collapse of an underground tunnel. They're trying to get their way out. And so in a sense, she's trying to do it for him. But over the two books, her own motivations and ideas become clearer to her and to the reader as well. So part of it is that journey to figure out and to articulate things that you don't know yourself about why you want what you want.
And one of the things that actually I liked about her the most was how unapologetic she was. She's truly driven by obsession in this case. Nothing matters more to her. I know she really does love her friends, her family, her life. She cares about the wall more, and she's not always very likable. And I think you really embraced that. Was that a conscious choice?
Yeah, first draft, she was far more unlikable than she is now. And then my readers told me, look, this is not just unlikable, this is alienating. So make it like a little nicer. The version that you now have is actually a much more likable one than the initial one. I think the initial version had become almost a caricature of just like obsession that then finds like a human shape and form to articulate itself. This version at least is a bit more human. So the idea was that the protagonist is someone whose drive or desire or obsession is not immediately understandable and not immediately something that you, the reader, might empathize with. But that over time and over the books, it becomes clearer both to the reader and to the protagonist herself. Like she has her own journey, right? Her own arc. And by the end of it, it should make more sense than it began to make in the beginning.
And Mithila is sort of a baby revolutionary in a way. She becomes obsessed with the work of Taraf, who is this poet activist, but she actually stays away from the previous revolution until it actually comes for her. Why is that? Why is her version of revolution so different?
Because in the beginning, the revolution that she wants to accomplish is actually a very individualistic revolution, right? Of course, it's through her group of close friends. They're united by this desire to go beyond the wall. The desire to go beyond the wall is not a desire to collectively change the world, but a desire to know and to see what you have been, forbidden or can't see all this while. So in that sense, it is a revolution defined by an individual wishing to go beyond the boundaries set for them, a very sort of classical sort of revolution in that sense, right? Which is why she, at the beginning, is not particularly engaged with the broader political upheavals in the city, which of course are of a more collective form, is economics and so on. Of course, until, as you said, it comes for her in later on in the books. And then at some point the two merge, like her desire to go beyond the wall and the revolution in the city become indistinguishable. But for a long time, actually, her revolution is almost at odds with what's happening in the city, because all she wants is to be able to leave the city, leave it behind in some way.
And despite starting her revolutionary group, which is kind of like a youth group,
yeah,
she isn't actually a leader in the traditional sense, in that she doesn't really have plans for the future. She's not thinking about the bigger picture, except in a very simplistic way.
Yeah.
So when she ends up being a figurehead, it's actually a bit surprising.
Yeah.
And why did you choose to go in that direction?
There's this very famous line, you see it in China Mieville's October, that sort of narrative nonfiction account of the Russian Revolution. The Bolsheviks are, is that uncertain phase where the Tsar is sort of overthrown, but it's unclear what's going to happen next. And there's a scene where Lenin is sort of vacillating, hesitating, and then a worker comes up to him and says, look, take power when it's given to you. Right? So it was a bit like that. The idea was that there are moments where you aren't prepared to be leading a revolution. This is something you never wanted or were interested in or even had thought about, except that revolutions don't work with that logic. There may come a time when the revolution demands that a certain kind of person be a figurehead. And if that person is you, then, you can't really sit it out in that situation. So it was more like that. And then how do you respond and how do you grow into that role and then what do you do? Which is all, I think, very interesting to explore. So I think that in fiction in general, the leader who's unprepared, and of course there are many variants of this, and the leader who's unprepared and the leader who's unequipped and then has to find their feet in the role is far more interesting than born to lead, born to rule, was the hidden sort of Aragon, right? Could be for the longest time a Strider, but ultimately Aragon is born to lead. Which of course I love Aragon, right? And we all love Aragon. But I think it's a lot more interesting when the person is going to make mistakes, a lot of mistakes, is scared, is frightened, is hesitant, and still has to do it. And then how do you, engage with that?
In defense of the giant Aragon poster that I have in my room right now, I must say that he did deny his heritage for a long time, right? So I think that's also something that you see in Mithila's situation, where she's a little bit in denial about her power and tends to think of it as something she can pick up and put down, as opposed to actually being of value to the revolution as a figurehead.
Yeah.
Speaking of leaders, actually my favorite character was Rama, who is one of the best examples, I think, of character development in the books. And she's someone whose world was actually quite stable until someone like Mithila comes into it. And then she finds herself kind of completely overturned, not just by Mithila's presence, but by Mithila leaving as well. And in many ways, who she reveals herself to be is a surprise even to herself. What went into the creation of Rama? Why was she so important to this?
Yeah, that was definitely the character I had most fun writing. And, I think the character who most surprised me as well. I think there's this whole tradition of writers who tend to be surprised by their own characters because they do things they don't expect. I think while every other character was sort of predictable for me while I was writing them, Rama was completely unpredictable. He was doing all kinds of things that I couldn't understand. I think that her character, well, it's the opposite of Mithila in that she is, in a certain sense, born to lead, in that her father is a prominent figure in the governing council. And she herself grows up in that atmosphere and has talents that are clearly identified by the governing bodies of the city and is being primed for entering that role, except that she has to enter it for various reasons much earlier than she anticipated. And that itself leads to a chain of circumstances that place her in a position of power that she would not have anticipated coming so soon. And then she has to adapt to it. I think for me, what was interesting was, yes, you were being prepared for this role, but you've come to it when you are unprepared for it. So how do you evolve to fit that role? And the second thing I think was, and this is something that's always interested me a lot, is that you're a child and a teenager, you have certain ideals, and Rama has many ideals. And you think to yourself that whatever role you occupy in life, you will always be able to hold on to those core ideals, around loyalty, friendship, doing the right thing, always, and so on. And then reality comes and you find that there are often situations where in the classical Greek sense of tragedy, whatever choice you make, there will be outcomes that will be terrible. And you will be responsible for them even though you had no choice. It's what the Greeks called moral luck, right? So it's just that you get morally unlucky. You do things that you have a defense to them. You had no choice, but nonetheless, you are judged morally and ethically by what you've done. And so then how do you deal with that? And how do you try and exercise power in a way that you can still have those ideals? And then what do you give up and what do you not? So I think all of those questions became, I think, central to Rama's actions as the books go on.
Politics are a large part of the books as well.
Yeah.
There's many layers of socio-political dealings, from old battered revolutionaries who are still operating under the radar.
Yeah.
There are exploited farmers, which seems a little prophetic, I must say.
The books were written before the farmers' movement. And if I remember correctly, when book 2 was published was exactly when it was happening. So it was quite on the nose in that way. Yeah.
Very much. But it also features rich conservatives who are kind of clinging to power, worn down liberal faction, all a little too close to home, I think.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a bit about why politics are essential to the story?
Yeah, so there is an appendix after book 2 that sets out all the inspirations in some detail. So yeah, I'll just direct readers to that if they're interested after reading the book. But I mean, it's all fiction is political. From the moment that you choose what governing system that will exist for your book, you're making political choices. And I think that a large amount of genre fiction, and there are exceptions, of course, and there are more exceptions now than there were earlier, is conservative fiction just by virtue of choices that people make with respect to starting off with empires or monarchies and stuff. And that automatically constrains what you can do. For example, if you have a monarchy or an empire, you're already in a certain sense pre-industrial age. You're not going to have labor unions then without sounding very anachronistic. There wouldn't be workers' rights in that sense. You just constrain yourself in the very beginning. And of course, like I said, this does not apply to all genre fiction. But what I'm saying is that every world building choice is a political choice. And I think that if you have the choice, why not try and make radical choices than conservative ones, right? One thing I've always been interested in, and I think that contemporary SFF maybe doesn't do this enough, is urban revolution. There is such great material for fantasy and science fiction, but you don't see it happening enough. Terry Pratchett's Night Watch is perhaps the most brilliant counterexample, right? So I wanted to explore that. And there was a lot of material I could, use for that.
And I actually, literally in my notes, have written Pratchett's quote, which is, "Don't put your trust in revolutions. They always come around again."
Yeah.
Revolution looms very large in these books. And it's a stark contrast. There are people who have been exploited by the system, but they're not thinking about breaching the walls. They're thinking about changing the status quo within the walls.
Yeah.
And there are the ones who want to break the wall and seize the horizon.
Yeah.
And that contrast, I think, is it's very stark. And the other is it's quite essential to the movement of the story.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I think that this, again, goes back to two initial motivations I described for the book, underlying the book. One of which is that this idea of artificial scarcity and that being embedded in, well, presently you could say neoliberalism, but broadly within capitalism, right? And so the question being that, is it possible to achieve genuine liberation or emancipation as long as you keep the overall structure intact, so incremental reform and so on? Or to achieve any kind of emancipation, have you actually got to overhaul the underlying structures? And this is the classic debate that we know as reform or revolution that Rosa Luxemburg and Bernstein had many, many years ago. And it's been a staple feature of political debate since then. So what the book explores is actually that, is it possible to achieve genuine freedom within an overall structure that denies it? Or do you have to actually overhaul the structure? And if so, then obviously there'll be a price to pay. And is that price worth paying? And who pays the price and all of that. So that's why that dichotomy between the people who want to bring about a reform in how life happens within the wall, and those who argue that you can't actually do that in a true fashion.
And I think also it's quite interesting that they expect things to change in the first place. It really shows how chained people are to the small world that they live in. It's very hard for them to even imagine a life outside of the systems that have already been set up. And in the books, it's literally set out in these tiers that they live in. And it even affects the way they're called as names. Like Mithila is Mithila 7 because she's from Mandala 7. And that really gives us a strong clue, just an introduction as to your social status. So how did you come up with the idea of the mandalas themselves?
Yeah, that was urban planning. Basically, I did a bit of research, and you do have cities where it's organized in that circular way, Baghdad of the 8th century and so on. So that was more to do with just looking at urban design. With respect to the hierarchies, which again, to stress, it's not that those in the outer mandalas, don't have enough to eat or are starving or are under the boot. It's not that. It's just that there is a hierarchy, but it's not that it is deeply tyrannical or authoritarian. Everybody has a decent minimum standard of life. Now, why this? Because it made sense that in this constrained world where resources are scarce and at a premium, it's very important that the distribution of labor and work is planned to a degree that ensures that nothing can go wrong, because if one thing goes wrong, then basically everyone dies because you have nowhere to go to. So from agriculture to sewage to the disposal of bodies to the manufacture of clothes to building materials to mining, all of that has to happen in a way that ensures that the physical constraints imposed on you by the wall are actually, you live within those constraints. And then it just makes sense to have a very clear demarcation of who does what and arrange spatially just for efficiency.
And of course, that also has crept into their social interactions. For example, something that, the first revolutionaries were very against was marriages between different mandalas, and which, of course, to me, immediately made me think of the Special Marriage Act and things that are very real to us today. And it's something that I think crops up quite a bit in terms of just human nature. Whatever the motivation for the creation of these rules, we tend to take them and twist them to our own purposes.
Yeah.
I noticed that in the book also, for one, homosexuality is viewed very kindly, which is, of course, a huge change from our reality. But the other is that this marriage between social hierarchies was looked upon quite badly, or, it was difficult. That's a pretty specific choice. Why did you go with that?
Same-sex relations it was very intuitive and very obvious that in a world like this, where again, for your resources to last, you are dependent on maintaining a certain set population. It would stand to reason that many of the prejudices that our world has with respect to homosexuality, there would not be a material basis for that at all. And then, of course, again, I think this was something that Rick Riordan at some point said when he was talking about Percy Jackson, was that if you have a chance to recreate a world of your own, why would you populate that world with the same oppression, the same hierarchies that are there in your own world, when you have the freedom to not do it? Of course, it's not going to be like a utopia, so that's a different form of writing. But why would you just take homophobia from our world and just transpose that into a fictional world when you need not do it? It's not really required by your narrative. So that was a very obvious choice. But as far as the marriage goes, again, so it flows from the same sort of idea that social norms and legal norms would reflect the underlying political economy. And so in order to ensure that this division of work, that itself flows from this very constrained physical environment, is respected, you make it difficult and harder for marriages across circles. Again, you don't outlaw it, you don't penalize it, because that is literally authoritarianism. And again, this is not an authoritarian system in the classic sense, but much like our world, you just disincentivize it.
Myth, magic, and science kind of hold equal space in these books. Humans don't actually understand how they came to be behind this wall. and they equal parts fear and long for the unknown. So they invent creation myths to fill the gaps, and a religion that casts them actually as wrongdoers. They're being punished by being kept within the walls. Why did you choose to portray religion in that way and the creation myths in that way?
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things for me is how creation myths really define the path society takes and end up really casting this long shadow over what is possible even today. And one author who I think does this really well and whose work has strongly inspired this is Ismail Kadare, the Albanian writer, who really explores in great detail the interconnection between myth, poetry, and nationalism. So how do the ideas of a nation form through myths, and then certain paths are opened and certain paths are foreclosed. So that idea of how everyone is always looking for origin, and how the search for origins constrains the present and the future that are possible, was something I was keen on exploring. Because here the origin myth not just gives you an origin story, but also tells you that you must not do X or Y in the future, such as trying to go beyond the wall, because that breaches the conditions under which you were put within the wall. So this is the idea of how origin myth act as chains upon what you are allowed to imagine and what you can imagine, even in the future, was a theme that I was keen on exploring.
I think what really struck me was that, by the way, readers, if you don't want to hear spoilers, please turn off at this point. But at the end, they come to realize that actually the creation myths, the religion, everything that is kind of spiritual about their stories actually comes from them. It's not planted, it's not pre-planned for them. It's something that humans quite naturally came together and invented for themselves. It really made me think about human nature as a whole, because, as a race, we are full of origin myths. And was that something that you were thinking of also as you did this?
Yeah, the origin myths essentially play a justifying function. They justify to ourselves why we are where we are, and why some things are the way they are and some things are not, and often why some things we want are things we can't have. So I think they play this crucial legitimizing and justifying function in society, and they are human creations ultimately. That was definitely a core idea of the books.
And while we are all still in spoiler territory, I'll say betrayal is actually a huge theme in the book. And I didn't realize how much until I came to the end, but there is like a kind of consistent kind of cycles of betrayal. There is Mithila and Rama, there is Mithila and Meenakshi, there's even Mithila's father, Ananta, and his relationship with his children. And I won't give away the biggest betrayer, but there's a kind of a shock reveal at the end. There's always going to be another twist and turn in this story. And in the end, you realize that so much of this kind of scenario that they're in is manufactured. And that is the biggest betrayal of all. Why so much betrayal, Gautam? Why?
It's nothing to do with, I've not spent my whole life being betrayed by people. I think, that it's a great storytelling, device, really keeps people sort of invested in the story. So that's one thing. But I think more than that, its role in the story, actually, the people who engage in betrayal don't actually think what they're doing is betrayal. Because I think one theme the book explores is that when you are fully invested or believe in a cause or in the justness of the place you want to get to, the destination, then the things you do along the way are things that you are able to justify to yourself as necessary to get there, or else there would be a worse outcome for everyone concerned. And so I think the people who do the betrayal, apart from maybe one or two instances, don't really think of it as betrayal.
I think before we wrap up, I actually wanted to ask about Smara, which is a kind of driving concept in the book. And it actually really made me think of Guy Gabriel Kay's Tigana.
Tigana is a huge influence. Like, it's one of the best fantasy novels, I think, in existence ever. It's such a good one.
I completely agree. And your work really made me think of that. What kind of inspired Smara?
It was actually a lot of Guy Gabriel Kay's writing, to be honest, because he explores this idea of memory and how a memory creates the world, in such a beautiful way. So Smara begins the book as the characters think that it is a word that signifies it from nameless yearning for a world beyond the wall. So it's one of those words that only exist in specific contexts, like the Welsh word Hiraeth, those classic words that you'll find in the dictionary of nameless sorrows. There are all these words that exist for a specific emotion and specific time. So Smara begins as just a word for an emotion that there's no other word for. Like in a world within a wall, the desire to see what lies beyond. And as the story goes on, it turns out that actually it means something else, something different. And that's the root of the characters actually understanding what lies beyond the wall and why the wall is there. But I think that the overall idea was, again, the sense that what is remembered and what is forgotten is never natural. There are always agents and forces that determine what is remembered and what is forgotten. And the world is shaped by what people remember and what people choose or are compelled to forget. And what happens when that is blown open, right? So when there's something that you're not supposed to remember, but you do, something you're supposed to forget, you remember it. How does the world change? And that was the idea of Smara deals with that at its heart.
Thank you. That's a lovely explanation. And it's actually one of the concepts in the book that stuck with me the most. So I'm glad we got to talk about it. And before we wrap up, is there any new work that we can look forward to? Anything you want to shout out?
I have a couple of short stories. One is in the Gollancz Anthology of South Asian Science Fiction, and the short story that is in the Mint, last year's Mint, live Mint online, is called Urumai's Choice. I'm working on a novel that the draft is quite done. It's a different world because this world is done in these two novels. Different world. It deals with, old fascination of mine, anarchism. So anarchist societies and the death penalty, capital punishment, intersection of the two, and a lot of history, memory, all of that, the usual thing. So that's in progress, and hopefully at some point in the near future, you'll see it out there.
Some lighthearted themes for us to look forward to. But I was going to say, was it going to be book 3, which would be something like, I was trying to find as lovely a title as The Wall, The Horizon, and now Wallless.
I've left open a little space, I think, at the end of book 2, if there would be a book 3 at some point in the future. Not right now. I think that story has been told, and I feel I am, for now, done with that story. But if in the future that there is a chance to return to this world, then I think there is a window that's open in book 2 that will allow for a third book. So who knows?
Well, we'll keep our fingers crossed for Wallless. Thank you so much for being here with us, Gautam. It was a pleasure chatting with you and hearing all about the books, and I can't wait to read the new one.
Thanks so much for that very close reading you've done and the really great questions.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Arcx is a mini-series from the Subverse, the podcast of Dark and Light, a digital space that chronicles the times we live in and reimagines futures with a focus on science, nature, social justice, and culture. Follow us on social media at Dark and Light Zine or visit darkandlight.com for episode details and show notes.